picture that I found on Facebook last week. As you see the picture here, it simply says, half of year or grace. Can you say it together? Half of year or grace. Especially today marks the halfway point of 2026. We have already journeyed through 6 months, and now we stand in the beginning of the second half of the year. As you look at this picture, notice the person standing in the line, and the timeline below reminds us that we have come this far. We have come this far not by our own strength, but by God's grace. In the same way, today we are standing here because God has faithfully led us every step of the way. So before we continue, I would like to invite you to take a quiet moment. Think about how God has been faithful, not just for last 6 months, but in your life. Not only during these past 6 months, but throughout your entire life. Perhaps there are moments of joy and celebration. Perhaps there were seasons of disappointment, uncertainty, or tears. However, through every season, God has never left you. Do you agree? God has guided you, provided for you, protect you, and sustain you by His grace. When we look back, we often realize that even in the moments when we could not see His hand, He was still at work. Yes, God has been faithful in every season of our lives. Can you say it together? Follow me. God has been faithful in every season of our lives. Do you agree? Yes, His grace has carried us to this very moment, and His faithfulness will continue to lead us through the rest of this year 2026 and the rest of our lives. Especially today, we are going to look at one of the most important days recorded in the Bible. It is a day that reminds God's people of His faithfulness and salvation. However, some of you never heard this day before. Yes, this day, it is called the Feast of Purim. Can you say it together? The Feast of Purim. As we study this passage, let us meditate on the meaning of this Feast of Purim and discover how God was working behind the scene and how God is still working in our lives today. So let us read the book of Exodus chapter 9 and verse 26 one more time together. Ready, go. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the term Pur, therefore because all the Before we look at Purim, we need to understand the background of the book of Esther. Have you ever read the book of Esther? Especially one of the most unique features of Esther is that God's name is never mentioned, not even once. One more time, God's name never mentioned, not even once. At first, we might ask, where is God? Where is God? That is exactly the point. Although God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, God is present on every page. Throughout the story, God is quietly directing events, opening and closing doors, and accomplish His purpose. His name is hidden, but His hand is unmistakable. So before we continue, let's briefly meet the three main characters in the book of Esther. First, it is Esther. Esther was the queen of Persia. Esther was the queen of Persia. When God's people faced destruction, she courageously risked her life to save them. Therefore, Esther teaches us to trust God with courage. And secondly, Mordecai. Mordecai was Esther's cousin and guardian. He remained faithful to God and encouraged Esther to do what was right. Therefore, Mordecai teaches us to remain faithful to God. And lastly, Haman. Haman was a powerful official who planned to destroy the Jewish people. However, God overturned his evil plan and rescued his people. Therefore, Haman reminds us that God's plan is greater than evil. So now let us remember three characters, Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. Now, let us read our passage today once again. Ready, go. Therefore, the poor this day free, after the term poor. Therefore, because all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, this raised an important question first. What does Purim mean? Have you heard the word Purim before? What does Purim means? To answer that, we need to go back to book of Esther chapter 3 and verse 7. For example, let us read Esther chapter 3 and verse 7 together. Ready, go. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day. And they cast in months after months till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Likewise, the Bible tells us that pur is a Persian word meaning lot. We can think of it as something like rolling dice. Rolling dice. Have you played rolling dice, right? Yes, Haman cast the pur, the rolling dice, to choose the day on which the Jewish people will be destroyed. Haman, he believed that chance and his own power will guarantee his success. However, Haman, he forgot one important truth. Especially, we can find that truth in the book of Proverbs. For example, let us read book of Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 33. Ready, go. The lot is cast into land, but its every decision is from the God. But its every decision is from the Lord. Likewise, people may cast the lot, rolling dice, but God determines the outcome. Therefore, instead of becoming a day of destruction, God turned it into a day of deliverance. That is why the festival was called Purim. So the feast of Purim is not about luck or chance. It is about God's providence. It reminds us that God is always working behind the scenes according to His perfect plan. Especially, the same is true in our life today. Sometimes life seems uncertain or random, but our lives are never controlled by luck or coincidence. Yes, our faithful God is always in control. Can you say together? Our faithful God is always in control. Do you believe it? Yes. However, God did not allow Haman's plan to succeed. So let us continue to follow the story today. When Mordecai learned about Haman's decree about the destruction of Jewish people by using the rolling dice, Mordecai asked Esther to go before the king and plead for her people. Especially this was a dangerous decision because anyone who approached the king without permission could be put to death according to the law of Persia. However, Esther, she chose to trust God. So before going to the king, she called the Jewish people to fast and pray. For example, let us read Esther chapter 4 and verse 16. Ready, go. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, through it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Yes, the most important Bible verse in the book of Esther. Can you say together? If I perish, I perish. That was Esther's faith. Therefore, God honored Esther's faith. Yes, the king welcomed her, listened to her request, and exposed Haman's evil plan. At the same time, the king remembered before that Mordecai, he had once saved his life before, but had never been rewarded. Therefore, Haman's plan completely fell apart. What looked like certain destruction became a great deliverance because God was faithfully working behind the scene. Yes, this is the message of the book of Esther. Human plans may fail, but God's purpose never fails. Even when evil seems to be winning, God is still in control. God turned Haman's plan of destruction into a day of victory. One more time, God turned Haman's plan of destruction into a day of victory. What began with fear ended with joy. What began with death became a celebration of life. That is the power of God's providence. To remember God's great deliverance, Esther and Mordecai established a new annual festival, the Feast of Purim. Can you say together? The Feast of Purim. Let us read verse 26 one more time together. Ready, go. Therefore, they call these days Purim, after term Purim. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them. Do you remember what Purim means? It means luck and what it might compare to rolling dice. Haman trusts the luck. He believed it will determine the day of the Jewish destruction, but Haman forgot one important truth. The dice do not control history, God does. That is why the festival was called Purim. God turned the very symbol of destruction into a celebration of salvation. Our faithful God is always at work, accomplish His perfect plan. Therefore, today, as we remember the Feast of Purim, let us also remember its first message. Trust in God's faithfulness. Can you say together? Trust in God's faithfulness. One more time. Trust in God's faithfulness. As we have reflected on the Feast of Purim, we haven't seen God's faithfulness revealed in a remarkable way. Even when His name is never mentioned in the book of Esther, His faithful hand is at work behind every event, keeping his promises and protecting his people. Also, through the Feast of Purim, we discover one important theological truth, God's providence. Can you say together? God's providence. 하나님의 섭리. Yes, God's providence means that God is sovereign, working out His perfect plan. God rules over every event and every circumstance according to His good purpose. The book of Esther is one of the clearest pictures of God's providence. Although God's name is never mentioned, His hand is seen everywhere. God placed Esther in the palace, used Mordecai's face, and turned Haman's evil plan into his people's deliverance. That is God's deliverance. The same God is still working in our life today. Even when you cannot understand His plan, we can trust that He is guiding our steps and accomplish His perfect will. So remember the message of Purim. Trust in God's faithfulness. Even when you cannot see His hand, you can trust His heart. Also, the second message of Purim is this: trust God's timing. Can you say it together? Trust God. One more time. Trust God's timing. Throughout the book of Esther, we see that God was never late. Before Haman even plan began, God had already placed Esther in the palace and prepared every detail for the deliverance of His people. Esther was not queen by accident. She was exactly where God wanted her to be at exactly the right time. The same is true for us. As you know, sometimes, even myself, we want God to answer our prayers immediately. Do you want right? Sometimes we wonder why He seems silent. But let us remember this truth. But God's timing is always perfect. One more time. But God's timing is always perfect. For example, let us read the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. Ready, go. He has made everything beautiful in His time. Also, He has put eternity to man's heart. Yes, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Do you agree? Yes. Notice that it says His time, not ours. While we wait, God is still working. Therefore, waiting on God is not wasting, it is trusting. So whatever season you are in today, continue to trust God's faithfulness, His providence, and His perfect timing. In His time, God will make everything beautiful. For example, I'd like to share one personal story with you. Earlier, as you know, I asked you to remember a time when you experienced God's faithfulness in the beginning of the sermon, right? Now I'd like to share one of my stories. A few months ago, I gave Evans and Nelly a ride to their school in Chungcheongbuk-do, Eumseong, right? It seemed like a small act, but as I was driving for more than 2 hours, God reminded me of my own student days in New York back in 2009. Back then, transportation was difficult, and my aunt, who lives in New Jersey and is with us today, often gave me ride to school, and there was my dorm, and there was my college picture. Yeah, there was me. Yeah, As I remember my honest kindness, I realized something. Years ago, someone faithfully helped me. Now, God was giving me the opportunity to help someone else by nailing advice. Also, it reminds me of another season of my life. As you know, when I was studying in New York, I was involved in a serious car accident. Yeah, there was surgery, a long recovery, and many days when I wonder why God allowed it to happen. But today, when I look back more than 10 years, I can see God's providence. God used even the painful season to strengthen my faith and lead me into ministry. At the time, I could not understand His plan, but now I can see that God was guiding my life all along. That is why I believe God's providence is real. Even when we cannot see His hand, God is directing our steps according to His perfect plan. Because God has been faithful in the past, I can trust Him with the future. And I pray that all of us will do the same. The reason I share my story is simple. God is still working in your life. Can you see together? God is still working in your life. Just as God worked in the lives of Esther, Mordecai, and even in my life, God is also working in yours. Even if you can see it right now. The same God who was faithful yesterday will be faithfully tomorrow. In the same way, let us remember God's faithfulness, give thanks for His grace, and continue to trust Him with our future. And finally, the Feast of Purim points us to Jesus Christ. Esther was willing to risk her life to save her people. She said, if I perish, I perish. But Jesus did even more. Jesus willingly gave His life to save us from sin and death. Esther stood before an earthly king to intercede for her people. Jesus is our perfect Savior who gave His life on the cross and rose again so that we might have eternal life. At the cross, it seemed as though evil had won. Jesus was arrested, mocked, and crucified. But God's providence was at work. Wonderful defeat became the greatest victory in history. Through His death and resurrection, Jesus defeated sin, conquered death, and opened the way to eternal life. Just as God turned Haman's plan of destruction into a celebration of salvation, God turned the cross, the symbol of death, into the symbol of our salvation. One more time. Just as God turned Haman's plan of destruction into a celebration of salvation, God turned the cross, the symbol of death, into the symbol of our salvation. That is the wonderful providence of God. Above all, trust Jesus Christ, who has already won the greatest victory for us. Remember the Feast of Purim. Trust in God's faithfulness. Trust God's timing. Can you say together? Remember the Feast of Purim. Trust in God's faithfulness.